The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As gasoline prices soar to almost $4 a gallon, the American driving public wants Congress to do something about it, and it is our responsibility. Where I live, I represent a good part of rural southeast Texas, and many of these individuals are rice farmers and they work the land, and they can't afford the diesel for their pickup trucks and their trucks to go and work at the refineries in southeast Texas. And all people throughout the country have this same common issue. Why are gasoline prices so high, and why isn't Congress doing something about it? Well, part of the reason is Congress, instead of exploring our own natural resources, has decided to make the decision to punish energy consumption in this country and make it more difficult for America to take care of Americans. Congress's policy is, let's rely on OPEC, let's rely on that dictator Chavez and get their crude oil while we figure out something else to do on how to take care of ourselves down the road. But the problem is immediate, and we need to deal with it, and we can deal with it. The first issue, drilling for crude oil and natural gas. Now, because of Congress, we have made it impossible to drill offshore. This map of the United States shows 2 areas offshore. This blue area down by Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, this area in the Gulf of Mexico is where we drill offshore. And we're glad to do that. But that crude oil that we take from the Gulf of Mexico and distribute throughout the United States is good for America. But you see, Mr. Speaker, there's also more crude oil in the Gulf of Mexico by Florida. There's also crude oil over off the East Coast. And, Mr. Speaker, there's also crude oil off the sacred coast of California, the West Coast. But we don't drill over there. We don't drill in the Gulf of Mexico. We don't drill in the East Coast. Why? Because of Congress. So one thing we could do is lift the offshore drilling prohibitions, not the regulations, but the prohibition. But because of the environmental fear lobby that is so strong in this Congress, we don't drill where there's crude oil or natural gas. And way up here, not even on the map, is a place called Anwar where nothing is except crude oil. And we don't drill for crude oil in Anwar because of the environmental fear lobby and because of Congress. Let's lift those restrictions and take care of ourselves rather than relying on foreign dictators and OPEC to get our crude oil. Now, there is going to be another offshore drilling rig out in the Gulf of Mexico over here near this red zone. But it's not going to be built by Americans. Those rigs out there off the coast of Florida, about 48 miles, they're going to be built by the Cubans. And it's financed by the Chinese. That's right. The Chinese and the Cubans are drilling where America ought to drill. Doesn't that bother anybody? Lift the restrictions. The second thing we need to do is have more refineries. I represent southeast Texas. We have the nation's largest refinery and the second largest refinery. Down in the Sabine Neches waterway that borders Louisiana are numerous refineries, but they're running at capacity because we haven't built a new refinery in this country in 30 years. Why? The environmental fear lobby, prohibiting us from taking care of ourselves. So it doesn't do any good to produce more crude oil if we don't have the refinery capacity to produce gasoline and diesel fuel. So make it easier to have refineries in this country, and we need to take care of ourselves. I was somewhat embarrassed as an American citizen when our president, the most powerful person on earth, has to go and ask OPEC last week to produce more crude oil so we could have gasoline. And of course, they, in their arrogant way, said, well, we'll think about it. Maybe we will and maybe we won't. See, that's what's happening to our country. We're being held hostage because Congress won't let America take care of Americans. And, Mr. Speaker, we need to produce the crude oil, the natural gas that we have. We need to even produce and build more nuclear plants in this country. Right now, China's building 9 nuclear plants, and they have 40 on the drawing boards. How many are we making? We're not making any because of the environmental fear lobby won't let us build nuclear power plants in this country. So how long is it going to take Congress to get the message that we need to reduce gasoline prices, and one way to do that is to increase supply, and we can take care of ourselves. We're the only major power in the world that depends on other nations for our fuel and our economy. And this ought not to be, but it is just the way it is. And I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.